Welcome, everyone. We're glad you're joining us this evening for reading and Q&A with poet Major Jackson. My name is Cameron McGill. I'm a member of WSU's Visiting Writers Series team, along with DJ Lee, Pavithra Narayanan, Peter Chilson, and Chelsea Ratzlaff. I'm joining you this evening from Chicago, Illinois, on the ancestral homelands of the Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi nations. Washington State University locations statewide are on homelands of many Native peoples who have lived in the region from time immemorial. We express our deepest respect for and gratitude towards these original and current caretakers of the region. I'd like to start by thanking our partners and collaborators in tonight's reading, WSU Vancouver's Office of Equity and Diversity, WSU Vancouver's Office of Student Equity and Outreach, the WSU Vancouver Office of Academic Affairs, the WSU Vancouver College of Arts and Sciences, as well as WSU Tri-Cities Writing Center, the ASWSU, and Landescapes, Student Literary Journal, with a special thanks to students Allison Pang and Noel Niemeyer. Also, a special thank you to our tech gurus, Rob Baker and Brian Varner, for bringing us live to you all. We'd also like to thank our partner, Karen Weatherman, of WSU's Common Reading Program. The program's book selection this year is Trevor Noah's Born a Crime, a memoir about Noah's family, the relationship with his mother in particular, and his childhood growing up in apartheid South Africa. In their work, both Major Jackson and Trevor Noah explore themes of coming of age, identity, racism, and resilience with lyrical deftness, ample heart, and incisive humor. A quick note, our common reading link will be posted for students towards the end of tonight's reading. A couple housekeeping items, as it were. Please use our YouTube chat to engage and respond throughout the reading. We'll be checking it as we go. I can see it's kind of popping off right now. We'll have a Q&A after the reading, so post your questions for Major Jackson in the chat, and we'll try to get to as many of them as we possibly can. Our next event, hosted by WSU's Visiting Writer Series, will be with award-winning nonfiction writer Katina Bukodi. On March 16th, 6 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. The reading will be hosted on YouTube Live again, and you can find the link on our website. We hope to see you there. Right now, I'd like to welcome Dr. Thabiti Lewis, Professor of English and Associate Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs at WSU Vancouver, who will be introducing Major Jackson tonight. Thabiti?
Thank you, Cameron. I'd like to also thank our English department and all the entities that Cameron mentioned for making this possible. I'm going to approach my introduction of Major in a bit of an unconventional manner because we have a history that carries 3 decades, which really scares me because it makes me realize that I'm not as young as I used to be. But the last time I introduced him, he was a guest of mine at Willamette University about 13 years ago. And it is indeed an honor and a pleasure to do so again. This is, to some extent, to borrow a line from one of Major's poems on disappearing. For me, this introduction, a glance into what Major would call a ravine of yesterday. This to introduce you to Major, the human, the observer, the people person, which is something that you would have had an opportunity to get a sense of had he visited our campuses, our campus or our campuses. He's a man capable of immersing himself into whatever space he occupies. And that is exactly what happened to me 30 years ago at a house party, or his house party in North Philly, a city where I spent many summers away from St. Louis as a kid, where my older and quite bossy sister told me I had to meet her boy Major from Temple, who, like me, was a writer. And knowing my sister, she probably told Major the same thing when she introduced us and left us to go mingle and make a go of it. But, you know, it was very easy because Major, this kid who was finishing a degree in accounting and fashioned himself a poet, was easy to get to know. And it was easy because we both enjoyed literature and writing, and we both liked basketball. And this was as shocking to me as it was to discover that he, as we were talking that night, that he was getting mentoring from luminaries such as Sonia Sanchez and Houston Baker, who lived on his block in Philadelphia. When I got a chance to hang out with Major later that week after his house party, I got an early introduction to Major, who the poet that people know now as the urban stroller, the observer of his surroundings. After shooting for a little while and talking, we teamed up to play some guys slightly younger than us. And I'm really not lying that Major and I did win. But to my surprise, the loss that the young men experienced at our hands devolved into them getting into a pretty vicious fight. And one of them promised to go home to get something to help him achieve retribution. And after, the shock of the altercation, I thought nothing of it and kept shooting with the other kid. And then I heard behind me, the Beatty, let's go, man. And it was Major, no stranger to North Philly, tugging at my elbow. He's gonna come back. We don't want to be around here for what happens. Major, the observer. We would catch up occasionally at places like Furious Flower, where my friend Dana and I joined Eleanor Traylor, Miri Baraka and his wife, and Askia Toure for dinner. And when I arrived at the restaurant table, who do I see but Major sitting there soaking up knowledge with two of the Black arts movement's earliest pioneers. At one point during dinner, I was sitting across from Amiri Baraka, who chuckled and pointed at Major, who was sitting next to me, and said, I knew him when he was just a private. At that time, I thought to myself, he's a lieutenant, but who was I to argue with Amiri Baraka? 9 years have actually probably elapsed since our last real conversation, and so much has happened in both of our lives. It was as though I'd not spoken to Major for 9 days or 9 hours as we closed the space of those years in 90 minutes, renewing our connections. In his poem On Disappearing, he speaks of losing contact and reconnecting as though it were yesterday. I had difficulty reaching him, and prior to that conversation, and the only people I could get through to were his publicists. And, so I was like, man, I'm gonna give Major a hard time. But when I got him when he got me on the phone, we closed the gap of life, marriage, kids, work. It was the same old Major, gracious, funny, available, brotherly, chilling, all the time, observing the absurdities of life. And now make no mistake about it, he is no private or lieutenant, but indeed a major poet. I can give you the official biography that the publicist sent me, that he's the author of 5 books of poetry, including The Absurd Man, Roll Deep, Holding Company, Hoops, Leaving Saturn, which won the Kafka Poetry Award for his first book of poems, that he's edited volumes that include the Best American Poetry of 2019 and the Library of America County Cullen Collected Poems. I could tell you that he's been at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study of Harvard and awarded the Pushcart, a Whiting Writers Award, and been honored by the Pew Fellowship in the Arts. And it's all very impressive, and I'm very proud of him. But what I would like you to keep in mind about him tonight is that he, like his poems, will take us through, to quote Major, a boulevard, and this is me interjecting, and mossy fields of his steps and the sky full of his thinking in a manner that is unpretentious, thoughtful, and real. My brother Major's paragraphs of dust, to quote Major, will connect you to who he is. As you listen to Major, what I hope you will discover of my friend is a poet whose observations are of travel as he masters functioning in different landscapes from rural Vermont to the urban Philly and New York City. In poem after poem, he will share a stranger he has come to know. And you too will become acquainted with my brother, whom I find far from strange, irrational, or bizarre. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Major Jackson reading from his recent book, The Absurd Man. Thank you.
Dear Dr. Dabiti Lewis, of course you had to go there. I'm so moved and grateful and gratified, if nothing else, than to reconnect once again with a beloved brother from way back. And you get old enough, you know, it's the people from way back that keep you humble, that remind you of your journey, and your terrific introduction does me enormous honor, but it honors our friendship and that relationship we connected. I forgot that it was my house party, which is pretty funny. And really proud of you too, man. This has always been about community for me, and we watched each other grow up, and we got many more mountains to climb, but it's always good to know when you have folks beside you. I want to thank the good folk at Washington State, and I also want to particularly thank Peter and Preston and Cameron and the whole staff of the English department, and Rob, who's behind the scenes making all of this work. So let me read some few poems, and I'm going to read new poems, but I'm also going to read poems from The Absurd Man, which this month, actually this past Thursday, turned a year old, as it was right in the middle of the pandemic. So any opportunity I can read from it, I'll do so. Let me start off with a poem that was written, several poems that were written last summer, and I'll end with a new poem. In the 80s, we did the WAP. If you end your crusades for the great race, then I will end my reenactments of fly. And if you lean down to smell a painted trillium, then I will cast a closer eye on those amber waves. And if you stop killing Black children, then I will turn my drums to the sea and away from your wounded mountains. Who mothered your love of death? Here is a heart-shaped stone to rub when you feel fear rising. Give me anything. An empty can of Pabst, a plastic souvenir, a t-shirt from Daytona. Here is a first edition, the complete poems of Lucille Clifton. Give me an ancient grove and a conversation by a creek, charms to solve my griefs, something that says you are human. And I will give you the laughter in my brain and the tranquil eyes of my uncles. Show me your grin in the middle of winter. In the 80s, we did the WAP. You too have your dances. It is like stealing light from a flash in the sky. I promise no one is blaming you. No one is trying to replace you. It's just that you are carrying a tainted clock, calling it European history, standing in khakis, eyes frightened like a mess of beetles. Points of clarification. And though I say here sorrow beguiles me, I lose no sleep. And though I say our country's journey is one long rigmarole, its villages and ridges are succulent and sweet. And though I say here, watch me now. Truly, I'm shy as stage curtains, demure as cups of espresso. And though I quote Wordsworth, Zagayevsky, and Dow, I come from gunshots and beatdowns. Raw and dirty, the day was mild, the light was generous. And though I've said in the past, I wear September on my face, which is eternal, I treasure too. June morning soaked in song, July's fevered cauldron wilting us like seared spinach. And though we say darkness succumbs to the light, I've been reading Faust, questioning the morality of knowledge, our icebergs and mountains auction, earth collapsing, human flesh for money, crickets barking loud as general. And though we say, I do unto, I do, death do on cue, I'll forever hold her. a jewelry box in my lap full of prayers and stays against confusion. And though they say world without religions, without revelations, I am instinct effaced by reason. I swear I can reach up and touch your lap. I started a series in my first book called Urban Renewal, and here is one of the latest ones. It's an ekphrastic poem written in response to my former teacher, Professor Awan Mance at Mills College. Not only is she a terrific author and scholar, she's also a terrific artist, and she's doing a series of paintings called 1001 Black Men. Urban Renewal number 58. He was there all along, sporting a V-neck, a treatise on swagger with his double hoop earrings, in an olive beanie or neon green knitted cap, or a kufi as he crocheted prayers from his enduring lips. You saw him, but didn't see him. His eyes like skylights, the meatiness of his nose, a civil mustache gelling his mouth. His placid look of acceptance in a checkout line, his chiseled almond dignity on a train platform nearby as you swipe and tap. He lives at the rich margin of your fictions, a wafer pride standing in a gallery, reading a canvas, a smidge of his total being, son, father, mentor, friend, educator, artist, chemist, barber, or chef. Sometimes you have to train the ear to suspend what dark distortions that leave you deaf as a mirror. For even his yearbook smile is nuanced until he becomes martyr, a reason to march. Then you only see his death and all those cups. This is double major. I emerge whenever he confuses the lamp for a moon. It is then he thinks of fine bindings and ordered athenaeums. I own his face, but he washes and spends too little time behind his ears. He sees me in the mirror, behind thick clouds of shaving cream, then suddenly believes in ghosts. His other selves are murals in the cave of his mind. They are speechless, yet large. They steer his wishes like summer rain and amplify his terrors like newscasters. What he doesn't know. His dreams are his father's dreams, which are his grandfather's dreams, and so on. They possess a single wish. He knocks repeatedly on the bolted door to his imagination. Tragically, he believes he can mend his wounds with his poetry, and thus I am his most loyal critic. He trots me out like a police dog. He calls out thirst for pads and pencils, destiny. Our voices come together like two wings of a butterfly. On occasion, he closes his eyes and sees me. I am negative capability, the test to all men are created equal. We are likely to dance at weddings against my will. He pulled out the same moves, writing this poem, a smooth shimmy and a hop. This page is a kind of looking glass, making strange whatever stone carvings he installed along the narrow road to his interior. I suffer in silence, wedded to his convictions. He would like to tell you the truth about love, but we are going to bed. To bed. Think of me laughing. You're right to imagine me sobbing on the corner of 6th Avenue and West 4th, or raising a hashtag cardboard above my head near the Liberty Bell. You're right to picture me lying down below the gold dome Capitol demanding, don't shoot. It is my annual day of solid. What are these brown hands for if not to bury my eyes in the ancient rivers of wrongs? And isn't this my consigned single note in our final piece of music, mindless as a blink? So go ahead. You and I are once again rehearsing decency. It is the dream of loving fruited plains that do not love you back. It is our feet planted in concrete that has me weak. But first, give thought to my luxuries. The sunset I toasted over the Val di Schiano with an aperitivo in Cafe Poliziano the summer of 15. Or give thought to the promontories of conversation with my father yesterday, in which, among other delights, we discussed the dignity of eggplants, whose purplish tint reminded him of a great aunt. Consider my love of celestial bodies. You're better off thinking of me singing this morning a little Marvin Gaye, not what's going on, but I want you, sultry and soulful. A one-way love is just a fantasy. Oh, sugar. Forgive me for being bound up in the ecstatic right now. I do not regret my little bout with life. Okay, a poem, a new poem, written in the past 24 hours. I come from a time and neighborhood of great nicknames. I grew up with a Lefty. I grew up, of course, with a John John. I grew up with a guy named Catface. Catface. Always during a drive home, I give thought to that summer night around a card table outside playing Bones. No, it was spades. The silence between me and old man Ison, broken by a portable television carrying the night's baseball game. And Lil Ben and Catface, who clamored on about not paying attention and counting cards and on the whole, getting agitated with each other. Their exchange like some scripted moment of rising tension in an independent film. We scrutinized their faces and controlled the game through a series of looks and bodily communiques, our eyeballs volleying between our hands. Neither of us were drinking. Old man Ison, having renounced alcohol years ago after his wife died, and me being only 18, we drank lemonade from mason jars that sweated onto coasters. When we finished out the game with a full run of the deck, laying all the tricks and rejoiced in hysterical laughter. Catface, drunk on malt, flicked out his knife after a card fell from behind a chair. His eyes clouded in rage. He held the blade near Mr. Ison's face, accusing us of cheating. After a long silence, little Ben, who no one knew more than his name, a traveler without a home, or so we thought, laughed out loud, laughed louder than the baseball announcers play-by-play, laughed loud as the street sirens, loud as the nocturnal cries and screams inside the tenements, and then looked at us, almost as if beseeching us to join in, for which we answered with our own hoots, and those up the road began to guffaw. Parents watching kids disappear behind cars, playing hide and seek, suddenly laughing. Grandparents sitting at windows began to cackle. Young teens leaning into each other on stoops broke their smiles into a gleeful mirth of giggles, a swelter, like a big hug around Catface, pulling him out of his hotel of solitude and rage until it hit him like a bell which fixed his heart, and he himself began to laugh. A chuckle of sorts, then a blossoming of full-on, body-shaking, hollering and crying, until the whole neighborhood swelled into an amniotic sea of healing. Sorry to put that first draft on you folks, but why not? I was very happy to hear that the class is read a poem that I rarely read, called November in Xicheng. Back in the age of travel, before 2020, my wife and I traveled to China. And I'm very happy to read this poem. At least I'll read a portion of it. November in Xicheng. There are cities one won't see again, Joseph Brodsky. One, only a bearded smile shows below a conical hat, turning men to rice farmers. Or Wang Lung pulling a rickshaw, except I'm on a bamboo raft guided by a soundless Karen whose wooden pole dips into the Shanghai, spiking dead lotus flowers. Were this pottery from one of those dynasties, Ming or Han, there'd be a pagoda, an arching bridge, and us on a blue and white plate in silk robes practicing pieties, forever gazing, as on Keats's urn, though ravished in dry reeds. The mountain shy at my early arrival, clouds like tangled lingerie still skirting their range, up to ankles in sedge grass, a discouraged heron gawkily aims for a higher floor, then gives a raspy cluck, declaiming in bird speak, there goes the neighborhood. I want to embrace the scene for all its good, yet how, with you hotel bound, coughing, bedridden, the lake's quiet surface enters my spine, the hidden marble suddenly made visible like a torch from a flame. That stilled fisherman, inked to a shadow, inhabits a hanging scroll I've made in my mind. His back to net and rods, a panel perhaps in classic script, ideogram spelling out the swiftness of time, vertically of course, as he tries to stare past weed muck into a future obscure as we are, by an understory of shriveled lily pads, by reflection of an osier spilling hair. You've had it with crumpled tissues piling up like drafts. You've had it with traditional healing teas, cigarette smoke dragoning through walls. You've had it with squatting stalls, but not the hospitality of the Yi. Their rotating trays, lamb's tongue, hot pots, beef and bladder, old style songs, folk dances, the falsetto notes of the men, the pitch of cool and poncho frayed white cloaks, the ways to say beautiful in everyone's thoughts. Last night, I proclaimed art as a container for the self on a piano echoing Whitman, then worried I too loudly banged the drum. Our Chinese friends, tolerant of my campaign for a spirit radiant as the gold on their flag, clapped like flickering stars at the end of my speech. Today, I call my fears, spy movies, wiretaps, casual surveillance, the feeling of being watched, the terrors that enter the room while we sleep.
Hi, Major. I just wanted to jump in here quickly. We are hearing you, but there's just a little bit of scratchiness with your microphone. Is it possible that anything's on top of your mic or a loose cable or something like that?
Has it gone away?
It was hard to tell in that quick amount of time. I could, hard to say.
Okay, I'll continue speaking. I do hear the computer's fan.
That could be it ever so slightly. Definitely nothing. I don't think we need you to go to Best Buy and buy a new mic or anything right now. Yeah, we are hearing every word you say. Just if, yeah, I think we've
Thank you
done
for
what we
that.
can do
I
to try to get
appreciate
that.
it.
Yeah.
I have about three poems left, and then we can go to the Q&A. Now that you are here, I can think. What you really are is felt. The mainland of your feelings, a young Veronica Webb, and what we share are solutions. And not so much the Parisian air you tired of, nor the fat, sweaty bead coursing a décolletage, an unlikely consequence of the Kyoto Protocol, but the pleasures of lounging below French-style windows open wide as arms, whose blousy curtain is a shawl that formally hangs and informally shifts when you drift into the room like a Spike Lee dolly shot. The kids are dancing to some Ariana, but I'm watching what you do with your lips when reading silently around 4:22 p.m. on a Sunday afternoon. I have a weakness for marble winding stairs and tight two-person elevators, but the brasseries are waiting, as well as the football fans who need help cheering, for we are Americans after all, and are ready to hype even the locusts on the day of judgment. I don't care about the midfielder or the winger. You're smiling, and that's all the defending I'll ever need. Dear Zaki, for Intozaki Shange, 1948, 2018. Thoughts today of you emerged as I walked the streets, somewhat frayed and distraught by more hearsay of another poet's passing. This time, Greg, with whom I once shared a beer after a gig in the village. Shamelessly, I pelted her. I recall about Gilbert, Grecian islands, landscapes that cracked both pen and heart. Despite my bantering and poor taste, Linda indulged the young upstart hungry for gossip, our parade of mistakes, yet what she gave were lessons on being true to the calling. None of the angers some shape into being undone, but a gratitude for mornings of coffee brewed in a bricky pot, views of the Aegean, waves of blue, his shrill eyes. Glued to her voice, I ran a finger along the scarred oak table, carvings of a couple rejoicing in the fresh chords of a new love, wishing to foist their joys on the lonely, the fallen, unsuspecting tenants in that dark bar, Dylan plus Diane forever. Within Cupid's arrow, her mascara was thick as a Coleman's, a heavy sorrow rivering beneath drifting memories of her Romeo. The world's full of absurd men, free of guilt, whose kisses are lures that hook a would-be bride and flee, leaving musky trails, vaporous hopes, ruined bodies, the marked scents of beasts, closed eyes, singing bloodlines, their love of mirrors and creaky beds. Her news reminded me I'd yet named my debt to you. Once, David Murray in concert claimed the Peanut Bride stage. His famed Afro horn found the pulse of the crowd and, like probe, blew extensions to which, behind shades and bangles, loud leopard print. Ignoring the too proud, you swayed like a palm tree when the love space demand staged the next week's. I sought your local places, you act. You ate, restaurants and boutiques. I sought your plays, your books, your nappy edges, hipster spirit, boho freedom, you who spoke the holy order of Black poem so in the vernacular of us, the tempo of the good foot, rhythms and waitings and secret creaks. I felt baptized when you put in my hands Blakey's Quartet, a jazz message, at the record store on 3rd, out of the blue. Of course you lived in the chocolate works. You who could talk Karl Marx, mamboed from Flatbush to the Bronx, and all we hippies, divas, and black bohos discussed was you. Zaki at gallery openings, Zaki in club striking poses. When you died, dusk inside eyes everywhere, like the still lost Baudelaire and the woman who feared rainbows fading from skies, rubbed out by the erasers of gray clouds, lost their dance. Yet my profound paradox, I too caused enough crying women to fill a sky. A young man, my ambivalence was wide. I claimed as many as my hands could hold. Teary-eyed, their love slammed into my need to be loved endlessly like Christmas all the time. A greed born of the ego or a reckless allegiance to the now. I received all manner of guidance from brilliant women like you, but my pattern of love them, then leave them, ignored hearts. What use then this thunder in the mountains? I've learned to translate silence, to live under my own body, the unending alarm of so much suffering. You knew far more about the wounds of men no North Star could heal. We're bound to earth and wear each other's scars. And you, reader, so often I dream of the secrets of satellites, and so often I want the moose to step from the shadows and reveal his transgressions. And so often I come to her body as though she were Lookout Mountain, but give me a farmer's market to park my martyred mast, and I will name all the dirt roads that dead end at the cubist sculpture called my infinity. For I no longer light bonfires in the city of adulterers, and no longer smudge the cheeks of debutantes hurriedly floating across the high fruit of night. And yes, I know there is only one notable death in any small town, and that is the pig farmer. But listen, at all times, the proud rivers mourn my absence, especially when, like a full moon, you, reader, hidden behind a spray of night moon, drift in and out of scattered clouds above lighthouses, producing their artificial calm, just to sweep a chalk of light over distant waters. And my last poem pull it up here, is on disappearing. I'm so grateful that you tapped this poem for your introduction, Dabiti. On disappearing, I have not disappeared. The boulevard is full of my steps. The sky is full of my thinking, and Archbishop prays for my soul. Even then, even though we met only once, and even then he was busy waving at a congregation. The ticking clocks in Vermont sway back and forth as though sweeping up my eyes and my tattoos and my metaphors. And what comes up are the great paragraphs of dust, which also carry notes of my existence. I have not disappeared. My wife quivers inside a kiss. My pulse was given to her many times in many countries. The chunks of bread we dip in olive oil is communion with our ancestors who also have not disappeared. Their delicate songs I wear on my eyelids. Their smiles have given me freedom, which is a crater I keep falling in. When I bite into the two halves of an orange, whose cross-section resembles my lungs, a delta of juices bursts down my chin and like magic makes me appear to those who think I've disappeared. It's too bad war makes people disappear like chess pieces, and that prisons turn prisoners into movie endings. When I fade into the mountains on a forest trail, I still have not disappeared, even though its green facade turns my arms and legs into branches of oak. It is then I belong to a southerly wind, which by now you have mistaken as me, nodding back and forth like a Hasid in prayer, or a mother who's just lost her son to gunfire in Detroit. I have not disappeared. In my children, I see my bulging face pressing further into the mysteries. In the library in Tucson, on a plain above Buenos Aires, on a field where nearby burns a controlled fire and held by a professor, a general, and a photographer. One burns a finely wrapped cigar, then sniffs the scented pages of my books, scouring for the bitter smell of control. I hold him in my mind like a chalice. I have not disappeared. I swish the amber hue of lager on my tongue and ponder the drilling rigs in the Gulf of Alaska and all the oil-painted plovers. When we talk about limits, we disappear. In Jasper, Texas, you can disappear on a strip of gravel. I'm a life in sacred language. Termites toil over a grave, and my mind is a ravine of yesterdays. At a glance from across the room, I wear September on my face, which is eternal and does not disappear, even if you close your eyes once and for all, simultaneously, like two coffins. Thank you.
Thank you, Major.
Thank you, Major.
I know you read some select poems, and I just want to, if it's okay, I want to ask a question, or at least start this conversation. It's probably going to be two parts because I won't get many shots after this. And I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you feel your rural experiences living in Vermont, where you are certainly, engaging in these observations of that landscape, have enhanced, or how you've been able to maintain these urban reflections, and maybe how that's enhanced it, and then also if in doing so, talk a little bit about, answer that question and talk a little bit about the poem North Philly, where you talk about, I love the line, you gardened in the throats from Black soil, grafting onto gospel notes. And then you end with this beautiful line, I'm still in the dimness, writing their moans through like Braille. And so if you could just talk about, those sort of cultural connections and, how these landscapes have impacted your sort of, landscape work. Be great.
Well, fortunately, I have a great foundation. I had material by which that kind of launched me into a life of reflection. And I guess I had always understood that I was writing a poetry of place, but that sense of place was always ever widening. As someone who spent time, interestingly enough, my new home is in Nashville, Tennessee, and that is a place that I understood quite well as a child. And so there was always this duality. And when I was a kid, it was still kind of rural. Some parts of it were still rural. So having that contrast early on, as my friend used to call it, Black summers in the South. Those of us who grew up north, went south. And then some folks, it was vice versa. So yeah, exactly, like yourself. So it's interesting, that ever widening sense of place has not only kind of fed my deep understanding, hence what I was recently saying somewhere, that urban renewal starts off as a kind of a desire to pay homage to Philadelphia, but it grows in different directions. And here in Vermont, it's just, you know, it took me some time to start kind of learning the names of birds and trees and the mountains and absorbing it. And that was out of resistance. I didn't want to give up my cred, you know. But the truth of the matter is, Vermont has fed my imagination in innumerable ways. And I do not see them as necessarily warring tendencies within my own work, but corollaries. I'm quite able, as a poet that I deeply admire, who kind of grew up in the Deep South and was a friend and mentor, is a friend and mentor in some way. You start realizing deep overlaps, and a lot of times it's rituals, it's culture and it's rituals. So, and I'll say what I mean by innumerable ways is that places teach us to listen, places teach us to see. They give us a language. There's a certain rhythm, a certain pace that one experiences when they are in a new place. And so that ever widening is really kind of deep structural kind of impact. Did I answer the other question, David?
Oh, I think so. I think you hit the gist of it.
Well, regarding North Philadelphia, and regarding the poems that at least appear in this latest book, there's still memories embedded inside me that I've forgotten and that come back. So it's not surprising that some might read it as a return, but it was always there. And there's still poems to be written. Question is, do I have the courage to write them? And that's been the great kind of challenge.
Hi, Major. I want to jump in and get to some of the questions from the chat, if that's all right.
Sure, I can't see them, so if you
yeah, I'll go through them.
Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for such a wonderful reading, and for joining us this evening. It's a pleasure to have you as part of the series. Got a lot of questions coming in. I wanted to start with a question from Gabriel Davis, who asks, how do you write about current events, or when you do write about them, without being overridden by a sense that history may skew your meaning? I am constantly worried about that when it comes to my own writing. Thanks for your question, Gabriel.
Thank you, Gabriel. That's a fine question, one that I've many years have labored over, with the early belief that, and I don't know if this was training or education or schooling, but with the early belief that poems needed to somehow transcend their moment. And I started to balk at that early on, because I also know that art, beyond its kind of exalted status, is quite functional in our society. And so I've just given myself over to speaking to the moment, speaking to the now, without any kind of overly egotistical ambition for the poem to kind of outlast me or the moment that I'm in. There's a long kind of debate around this, and somehow that is a value or marker of high art. And yet I also, as regards current events, I also am quite aware that poems have multiple functions in our society. they can exist in a book. They can exist in a book like art pieces exist in museums or someone's archive. Or they can be extraordinary powerful tools for empowerment, for engagement, for reflection. I love this moment, and I believe it's Camus' essay, Create Dangerously, where he talks about there was a time in which the poets and the artists could sit in the stands and comment upon the men and the men being fed to the lions, and now they find themselves in the Colosseum, not in the stands, but in the Colosseum. So I also know that this is a function always for the artists. It's a function of the times that they're living in and whether or not their vision of their work is going to grow towards being a part of that conversation.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. Kind of jumping off from there, combining a few questions here in terms of what first got you interested in writing poetry, in terms of that, maybe that book or that poet or that event that always seems to give poets their first permission to be like, that's my life. Like I can do that. That is the life that I want. And maybe who are some of your favorite, your catalyst poets, as it were?
I fortunately at a young age had books in the house, so I initially go to moments in which there were poets who modeled being poets early on in my life. And somewhere in the interview I talk about hearing as an undergrad hearing Sonia Sanchez read a poem at a Kwanzaa event and just being startled by her energy, her flow, her greatness. And not that I thought I could be that, but I wanted to study with her. But the fact of the matter is my relationship with poetry goes back to early teen years. My grandfather and grandmother had only 2 books of poetry among stacks and stacks of books. Was Langston Hughes Selected, published in 1964, and a paperback edition of Robert Frost. And those were my introductions to poetry on the page. Not that any of those poems in those books were read to me. I stumbled upon them, and it was a great discovery for me. There's so many poets that I can name that launched me, but I'm ever grateful for my teachers in the poetry of Yusef Tumiaka and Garrett Hongo, who I had the great privilege of studying with out there in Oregon. Sonia mentioned, these are early poets, Philip Levine, Lucille Clifton, Gwendolyn Brooks. It's just so many folks in my back there, and I'm happy to say their names, but we would be here all night. Baraka, Miri.
Wonderful. Thanks. That's I hope all listeners out there are just jotting down the names of the poets that they have not yet heard of. I'm going to jump down.
Well,
here.
To that end, while you look, to that end, it's part of the reason why I'm writing poems to poets is because I am watching really stunning American poets become, and maybe that's the order of the world, disappearing from our syllabi, our anthologies, our general need for their literature is bypassing us. And it's part of the work of scholars, of course, and maybe even people who love poetry, but it's definitely incumbent upon the poets to kind of honor and name and give voice to those poets. I almost wept when an African poet, young, very talented brother, had named some poets for whom I hadn't heard their names in over 15, 20 years. I was just so moved by that. Melvin Dixon, I'm thinking of, was the poet that almost had me. To hear someone who I knew was being fed by Melvin's great sacrifice and power as a gay Black male poet, I thought it was just phenomenal, phenomenal.
Thank you for sharing that name. I'm looking at a few of the questions in terms of both inspiration, but also process. I love that we get a lot of process questions, and there's a lot of young creative writing students joining us tonight. And I think that's one of the really interesting things for writers to share with each other, and those insights into, what is someone else doing in their room by themselves when they're trying to figure this out? So would you care to talk a little bit about what your thinking and writing process is when you either begin or are working on a poem?
Mm-hmm. It changes. I'm either writing here, my home in Vermont, or now my new home in Nashville. And often it is because I have a community of writers who are making me accountable to myself, because I'm so busy these days. So we get together over Zoom. Prior to the pandemic, there was a group that I started some 18 years ago here in Vermont. We would get together every other week sometimes, and then other times once a month, but nonetheless, we got together and shared work. I would use those moments, those meetings, those gatherings to write kind of white hot first drafts. And those first drafts often began because I had a phrase, or I often do not know where I'm going. I often do not know what the poem's about until I hear those opening lines. And then I'm almost following an improvised spirit or note or idea until its end. Occasionally, because I'm working on a series of urban renewal poems, those have a kind of a preset structure. And often I'm listening to that structure, and as it's generating, as it's forming around an idea. Those drafts, just before I start to gather them into some coherent collection, I am looking for themes, and then I start revising towards those themes. And that's been done with the last 2 books. But those first drafts, they're just kind of white hot first drafts, really bad drafts, some of them. And then I rework them. And reworking them is as important as the first draft for me. In fact, I try not to have any attachment to it, because I want to kind of see where that draft is going to take me as well. Yeah.
Great. Yeah, I love that idea of listening to the themes that you let happen in your own work, maybe unconsciously a bit, and going back to those to write into them. Renee is asking, are there certain elements that you think makes a poem exceptional instead of just good? And a follow up kind of from Glenn is how do you know when a poem's finished?
Yeah, I have very at once narrow and wide measures. The narrowest measure is I'm at least personally, I'm not invested in poems that do not make a sound or make music. And if it's too close to the everyday prosaic voice without some kind of emotional investment, I understand that we've been writing a plain style poem for a century now, but I need the music, and the music is going to come from the lyricism that's embedded in the actual kind of sounds of the language and the syntax itself, or it's going to come from a kind of a deep, authentic selfhood that can imprint a way of thinking and feeling that feels unique. That's also my other definition of music. Whitman's song. Let's go there. Song. But on a broad level, I just want something that emerges, and this is my hope for my own work, that emerges as something that has not been heard before. That's all. I mean, it's as simple as that. If it broaches anywhere near the cliche or the overly familiar and the overly wrought that's made to sound new, I believe the poem needs to be reworked a little bit more. And that's a huge high bar for us as writers of poetry, but not one that we cannot reach.
Great. Thank you. We have a question here kind of about both place and maybe inspiration at the same time. Nora's asking where you feel most inspired to write, at home in Vermont or in Philadelphia or in Nashville, or when you're traveling and exploring new places. Like where do you kind of have that impetus to write most strongly?
I take notes other places and I write here in Vermont. However, since moving to Nashville, that's so new and fresh to me, and it is, I'm sure it will become a kind of important place to me, but it's so new. But I've been writing in Vermont for 18 years now, and it's been again, I'll tell you why it's important. I guess because if I reach a moment of stasis or nothing's coming, I can always go outdoors and let the brain do that kind of deep subconscious work. I can even go about my day. I don't even have to go out for a walk. And not that Vermont is, of course, deeply inspirational, beautiful setting, breathtaking at times. But it really is a kind of a sense of the place from even long before I even arrived here. When I visited, I could feel that this was a place that I could grow as an artist, as a writer.
Just to kind of a follow up to that, do you feel with kind of adding a new home to your life that the sound of Nashville will impact your poetry in a certain way? If we're talking about music, of course, is synonymous with that town in some ways.
I lived in New Orleans, and New Orleans also gets in the blood, but I was forewarned by many New Orleans poets not to write the New Orleans poem. And so that's going to be my kind of mantra with Nashville. there's a level of tourism that happens when you write about place, and I think part of the poem's charge is to somehow do more than allude to what makes a place, but how does that place kind of embed in the kind of deep psychic spiritual structures of who we are. I'm so happy that we are in an age in which we are acknowledging, doing land acknowledgements, because it's that attention is what I feel is what writers and poets and artists have been doing for a long time now. And to listen to the history, to listen to this land is ultimately going to be what helps us preserve and conserve this land. And that's not, poetry should not be trending in terms of its themes. And I feel like poetry of place can be a certain kind of trend. I'm talking something deep, structural in our relationship to language, our relationship to each other and the earth. And maybe that's why Vermont has been so big for me in that regard. And Philadelphia. I mean, I want to acknowledge that there's a section of Philadelphia that just lives in me, and it's right around. It's going all the way up from the Art Museum up to Chestnut Hill. That along that strip there is really important to me. It has been for a long time. The school king.
I love that, going to between this block and this block. These are, my heart is split in many places along all of these geographies, small and large. We have a question from Lauren, who says, after reading your work, that her students were struck by the approachable yet elevated imagery and language, by your grasp of narrative and image intertwined. Any advice for aspiring poets in regards to that balance of narrative and image work?
Yeah, I guess it's interesting. I was someone who, and this would be my advice, who went in fear of abstractions, because abstractions does just that, is that it disconnects us from the actual kind of concrete, substantive realities. And the imperative upon every writer is to find a language to name that reality. And abstractions is a kind of a shortcut to doing that work. The richness of every writer is their ability to kind of go deep inside language, or just say, dictionaries, whatever you can kind of gather around you, thesauri, so that's part of it. But interestingly enough, I was mentioning earlier about my growth has been one in which I realized that there's a social function to the poet. And in that role, or thinking about speaking to the moment, it's inevitable that we're going to have to deal with big ideas, and that they're going to enter into, let's say, concrete, substantive, deep, rich kind of tentacles into the world. And then maybe 25 to 30% of the language can be ideas, or big ideas. But to grow, I think, at least it was personally for me, I generally try to avoid it. Because we want we want the reading experience for anyone who encounters it to kind of be visceral. And to be visceral is to, like I said, get one's tentacles into language.
Luke is asking, somewhat related. He says, something I'm struck by with your work is the way you communicate detail feels elegant but not fragile. Can you speak to how you notice details and how descriptions of them come to you, and or how you process them?
Yeah, thank you. I'm not sure if I have a direct answer to that, other than I often encourage my students to keep journals, and I used to have them create a image journal. You know, anything that came across their site, kind of write it down. You may not even know, they may not even use it later, but to record it, it's really, really important, and encourages a certain kind of deep scene or conscious scene, being conscious and aware around them. I have gotten into great debates with my fiction writing friends about the rhetorical, the heaviness of figuration in my work, or in particularly simile and metaphor making. And for me, that's where the jam is. Like, that's where, if my brain could somehow find those analogs and those correspondences, that's where I know I'm doing something more than just recording my life or recording my impressions. It's keeping the imagination active and seeing active. So an image-driven poem, which is the foundation of at least my writing practice and my pedagogy. I know I'm working and teaching folks to kind of work their imagination to make those kind of cross references, cross images.
Thank you. Thank you. It's interesting you brought up that disagreement with fiction writers. There's a question here just about, which I think is really interesting. Do you ever bend the truth to make a poem more interesting?
All the time.
Wonderful.
All the time. We have to somehow, and maybe this is part of the work of the absurd man, is that the absurd man is, and major in the poem, is a construction made of language. Even if I attempt to write the most kind of, what's the word? Even if I attempt to write the most kind of accurate moment in my life, it's still going to fall short, because it is language and we're working with codes and symbols. It's still going to wind up being not as pure. However, and not just for the sake of story, but one has to realize that poetry is not merely a vehicle for expression, that it's as much exploratory and imaginative as other works of art. That's also my new kind of, not new, but I'm on a mission to kind of help the world to see that not all eyes are autobiographical eyes.
Yeah. If we talk about that a lot in creative writing classes, like, you know, the person who's writing the poem is not necessarily, the speaker is not necessarily the person who's writing the poem, and really to be thinking about the way that we represent that. So another part of this question was this idea of how as writers we represent people and places that we write about. And of course there becomes always the question of responsibility in witnessing. How do you conceive of including some of those more that traditionally truthful aspects of life for people and place in the context of the poem?
Well, first of all, I don't aim through my art to hurt anyone. So that's the first kind of baseline for me, is to kind of check and make sure that the poem does not implicate anyone in any way that is unfair. Secondly, and yet poets are truth tellers. That's one of their roles. I talk about lying, but lying in the service of truth, to get at something that is universal, or something that is allows us to kind of see our journeys and experiences in new ways, that has a lot of veracity, I think is important. But it is a balance. And I have friends who now are very responsible with their art. When they're writing about real life moments or autobiographical moments, they'll share the work and get feedback from the people who are either named or becomes evident. And that's a level of kind of turning one's work over that feels unprecedented in our time. I call it responsible, but I also want to say that, there are certain risks involved in that as well. So I guess, personally, I just want to make sure that the work isn't hurting anyone. And there have been poems that I pulled out of my manuscript, out of my collections, because they did not pass that test.
Thank you. Yeah. We have maybe time for one or two more questions, if you do.
Sure.
Elena is asking, are there any subjects you want to write poems about that you haven't yet, or are there subjects you've intentionally shied away from?
Yeah. I believe we are in a great age of exploring how gender is constructed. And so I very much want to write about masculinity. And yet, the models for that are not the best models. If you think about, I'm talking about it in poetry, that is. It can easily become it can easily become men, metaphorically speaking, in the woods with drums and exploring their wildness. And yet, that is an archetype. That's iconic, and there's other dimensions that I feel are worth exploring and naming. So, but I haven't formulated how to do that, because we need to be very, very careful that we're not reinscribing harmful modes of behaving in the world, glorifying that. Interestingly enough, writing about male intimacy, for example, is a very difficult topic to approach, mainly because there's been so much just kind of creepy behavior out there, so that's, I hope someone's making the connection here. I'm not sure if I'm making sense, but that is a topic that I'm interested in, and I haven't necessarily figured that out. It has to do with also levels of sensitivity and awareness, both personal and how that's replicated. Lack of awareness is replicated in our culture.
Thank you. Yeah, it's such an important thing for poets to be, for all writers to be thinking through, and thinking of those questions begins to plant the seeds of where they'll appear in the work. I kind of want to just wrap us up. with a final question and just a huge thank you on behalf of everyone on the Visiting Writers Series team and all of our students and tech folks and everybody that's made this possible. But thank you so much for being here. There was an interview that you did with Vanderbilt, I believe, where you talked about art as being, art can be, quote, an immense tool for community gathering. We are less alone when we hear the human condition articulated in a poem or essay. In the poem you read earlier in Double Major, that line, quote, tragically, he believes he can mend his wounds with poetry, unquote. I'm so interested in how the poems, specifically maybe in The Absurd Man, are looking inward, also reaching out for connection. Kind of after writing the book and reading poems from it now, like how do you see that play out?
Well, look at us now. I think art gathers us. It's a ritualistic act of gathering. There are awarenesses. I'm not necessarily saying my own, but it becomes a vehicle of exchange and exchange of ideas. Hopefully we grow as a result of those conversations or move to reflect or disagree. So on that level, as a cultural artifact, I believe the poems do that. I also believe poems are an encounter with language, and it's language that is artful, language that is framed as somehow different from our exchanges at the post office or in the classroom. And so in that regard, I also feel as though there's work happening there. The less alone part, however, I have students for whom we could not be any more different. And yet at the core, what brings us together, of course, is that we love language, going back to W.H. Auden's kind of assertion that at minimum, poets or writers, word artists, they aspire to make things with language. And in that regard, there's also that community action that's happening. And yet we don't share much, but our love for the practice of making a poem. Now, not that I've moved on from The Absurd Man, I treasure it, and I'm happy for the growth that's happened to me as a result of writing the poems. And I hope that widening of experience leads me to the next project, but it also helps someone else in their own particular work. I'm a total fan of Lewis Hines' book, The Gift. And I think if we think about poems in that gift kind of space, transactional space, it becomes, we start to realize how sacred and how much we need to treasure and support. Yeah. Thank you, Cameron.
Yeah, thank you so much, Major, for joining us. It has been our pleasure to host you, and thank you for the gift of your poems and for the conversation and for answering all these wonderful questions. We are grateful, and thank you all for joining us tonight. Hopefully you can join us on March 16th for Katina Bacote's reading on YouTube Live. And we look forward to seeing you all soon. Stay safe.
Thank you.
Thank you.